What's going on, everyone? Today we're making DNA 166, which is a DNA 250 board powered by two 18650s. Same as the DNA 133 video I got out there, except the board's a 250 instead of a 200. And the enclosure, again, I'm going with the Alpinetech 1590 P. Nice little enclosure. So stick around and we're gonna build one of these. If you watched the previous video where I used the Alpinetech P Plus enclosure, I didn't do any pre-wiring. I mounted the board onto the 3D printed board holder, epoxied that into the enclosure first, and the 510 positive was really hard to solder in that confined space. Having built a few of these, I changed the way I do that. So the 510 positive I'm going to pre-solder, whether I'm doing a 75 or a 200 or 250. And of course with the 200 and 250, the balanced charging through holes down here, that's some fine work. It'd be hard to do with the board pre-mounted, so we'll do those as well. And the way we're gonna do these, they're labeled on the other side, so ground 1, 2, 3, and because the 200 and 250 normally run off a 3-cell lithium polymer battery, the 1, 2, 3 here, it wants to see the positive of the 3 individual cells, and it does some math and it can figure out if one needs to be charged faster than the other, and that's how it does the balance charging. Now our ground's over here. We flip it around. Our ground is now here, close to the B minus, and then our 1, 2, 3s are here. So the board, we're going to be running off 2 batteries. The board still wants to see something on these 3 pins, so we're going to trick it. What we're going to do is the ground, we're going to use a short wire jumper onto the battery negative pad. The third positive one, the one that's closest to the ground, we're going to attach a single wire on here, which will come off this, and it will connect to the bridged side of our battery sled. The other 2 we're going to jumper together and then jumper that onto the battery positive here. We'll jumper ground over here, first positive pin here, single wire coming off, which will go to the bridged side of our battery sled. Next 2 jumper together and onto the battery positive pad. So we'll do that real quick. First, I'll load the pads here. I'll prime them with a bit more solder. Okay, real short length of wire for the ground pin on the balance charging through holes there. A little bit of flux on the pad, the opposite side. Now I'll measure my length on this wire to come reach the battery negative pad here. I'll strip all of this insulation. We'll tin that. Fold it down onto the pad and fuse that together. On the other side, I'm going to bear this longer than what I just did. We'll tin that. So we'll go through the first hole. Got a glob on the tip there. Through the first hole. I'm going to apply solder to both pads right now, but I'm just going to tack that wire on the pad that it's poking through. And I'll fold that over to the pad beside it. Trim it. See that? And the last one. Through a little solder or flux on that pad. Just like that. Oh, we're not done. We got to come onto the battery positive pad with this one now. So like I did with the ground, measure for length. Get rid of that insulation. Tin it. Bend over to the pad. And this needs to be long enough to reach the bridged side of the sled, and I'm going to use the top to bridge, so we've got plenty of slack there. I mentioned I wanted to attach my wire for the positive 510. Because we're so tight in that enclosure, I won't wire it this way. I'll come at it this way, and then this one we can make a nice natural bend to come reach the 510. I'm going to bear a little bit more. Remember I said earlier it's easy to bend untinned wire. I want a little bend in there. Just like that. Okay, that does it for the pre-wiring onto the board. So we'll get the board onto the board holder. Need to get our screen on there first. You've seen me do this a bunch. There's a little hinge, little door. You flip that up. And the ribbon connector goes on the inside there. When you close that little door, it'll be a tiny snap, a little click. If you do the internal mount method with the epoxy, like we're doing here, 2 of the 3 screws, I don't even know if you can see that, have one side of the head ground flat. It's to not have the fire button bind on the head of the screw here. So the 2 screws with the one flattened side you use on the top. You want to make sure that tighten them down enough so the head of the screw is below the top of the board mount here. The screen double fold over on the ribbon. and then line up the flat side of those screw heads. Alright, let's mix up some epoxy. Prepare our actuators. Peel the screen protector off. You want to cover the screw heads so that they can't turn, but you want to be careful around the actuators and the screen. Don't apply too heavy, because as we put pressure on this, it might squeeze onto it, and if it touches, it'll seize the actuators in place. That would be bad. And you don't want any to squish out onto the screen area. I do want some on the edges, but very little. All right. Nerve-wracking moment. I'm gonna hold that in place. One of these clamps. And we'll let that harden. I think I mentioned it in the other video, but I'll mention it again. Before the epoxy dries completely, try out the buttons, the actuators. If epoxy did reach them, it'll be easier to hold it from the back to like break that loose before it fully hardens. And if you have to, throw like a tissue over top, maybe just to protect the finish, and also twisting them free is another good way to break them free of the epoxy if that happens. We'll do the battery sled next. A couple things we need to do to these types of contacts. One, we'll snip that little lead that's on the bottom. And these are wrap wreckers. We want to bend this part of the contact in a little. If not, this catches on the wraps when you try and pull the batteries out. Just like that. It's not a lot, but that's all we need. I also squish them in a little bit, not too much. If they're open too far, there's a lot of pressure on the battery and it's hard to yank them out. But you can adjust that after the fact. So we'll do this same thing to the rest of the clips. Another thing I do sometimes, there's little tabs on here, probably hard to see, but they fold out, and that's what gives restriction to the clip in the channel that they slide in. This one's pretty good. This one. So if you find that they slide in too easy and it's too loose, you can pull these tabs out a little bit more, and the terminal will fit snugger in the channel they slide into. If you remember from the last video, we'll solder across the top of the terminals here, and not such a big deal up top here, but on the bottom I'm gonna go 1 gauge smaller for the wire, and which is fine. If you look at the data sheet for the DNA 200 and 250 boards, you can go 1 gauge smaller on the battery versus the 510 connection. So we'll jumper the top. So I'll get my length on the jumper wire. I'm gonna go a little shorter on this side because that's where the lip from the lid is real close to there. So we'll give it a bit of room. Say about there. Tin that. These short wires get hot when you tin them. There's our jumper. I'm gonna shorten the one on the left too, like I did on the right one here, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay, so let's tin the top of these. That's good. I just want to double check my distance. If you get this wrong, it's hard. You can't really bend it after the fact. So if we go maybe a millimeter between the insulation and this side, and almost 2 mil before the edge there. There's our top jumper. And then for the bottom, we want a single negative coming off of here, which will go, the board is sitting right, these will be right close to the two pads they need to go to, so the positive will just come connect to the board here, and same with the negative. And another reason I'm using I'm bothering to use the 18 gauge coming off the battery here, is if I'd have two 16s coming off, it's not wide enough to route both of those nicely over here, and the 18 will work fine. So tin the top of these two as well. You ready some wire.
Tin the wire first.
And leave your iron on for a while on these. They're plated, and you really want to get it as hot as possible for the solder to stick on there. That's nice. And see how nice they sit. We'd have a hard time doing that if we would have went 16 there. Good. The 510, which we need to do before we get the sled in there. Otherwise, even though the sled is notched out there, there isn't enough room to tighten the nut down. Just like the previous vid where I used this P enclosure, I'm going to send the negative tab of the 510 down into that corner. There's really no other spot for it, which means we'll have a really short run thick 16 gauge wire coming out of here that we need to come tack onto this pad. That'll be our hardest solder. Even stripping it with the little amount of room we have here is difficult, but we've done it a few times. I'm sure we'll be able to do it again. I'm going to bend this tab out a tiny bit. Let's tin that. Too much flux on there. And because of the angle of this thing, so this will be in the corner like this, we want our the negative wire to come straight up off of it, so we're gonna solder it on an angle like this. You bare and tin the tip of this. Okay. The positive 510. So we left ourselves some slack here. We'll do a nice loop. And this loop could be longer, right? If we're not 100%, if we're a little long on this wire, it's not the end of the world. Which will sit about there. So get some flux into that hole. I started dropping a little piece of solder in there. I'm going to load up the iron heavy for this. Get it started in the hole. It's a nice looking joint. I'm not gonna mess with it. let that cool for a sec before I reassemble it. Okay. There's our nut. I want to start threading the nut before it's all the way through. Another thing I've been doing, I started using some Loctite on the 510 nut. So I'm going to drop a little bit on the threading in here. Then you kind of got to be quick to tighten that down. It's too much. Sorry. So I'm holding the nut with my thumb. I also want to try and keep it as flat as possible, because the lip of the lid there I'm gonna solder everything before epoxying the sled in, because I can always lift the contacts out and epoxy the sled after we solder. The first one I'll do is the negative 510 up here. So I'll cut it as the pad it goes on is right there. So I'll cut it as short as I can off the top here. And now I don't have any room to strip it because I'm so close to the edge. So I'll carefully strip, try and cut away the silicone insulation. Just like that. I'll tin this. And I'll maneuver it over the pad and tack that down. The screwdriver I'm holding it down acts as a heatsink. So I didn't, I mean, it's on there, but I didn't get a, I'm not satisfied with that. Plus I just started, I had paused the video and I just restarted the iron not too long, so I'll heat that up again. Looks pretty good. Next I'll do the two wires here. So we'll do the positive first, and it goes on the bottom there. That worked out great. One negative goes on the top pad. Right there. And the balance charging wire, I'm going to try and run it underneath. There we go. And I can come right up. If I tuck it in here, it's thin enough that I can get in that notch on the sled. And you remember earlier I said even on this side I'd leave a little bit of space on the terminal. I'm gonna come tack it right there. Now I've always said you never want to solder onto these 3D printed sleds or onto the terminals with these 3D printed sleds while the with the terminals on there, because it's a thermoplastic and it doesn't handle heat very well. But in this case it'll be a 2-second touch. I'm fairly confident I could tack it on there without damaging the sled. Just like that. In fact, let's see if it powers on. This is the 75 I made in that previous video. Still vaping this one. All right. I need to go into eScribe and tell it we're running off 2 cells. It does this until you do that. And check the DNA 133 video. There's also it'll run once you tell eScribe you're running in on with 2 cells. But there's also there's a link on the old video to a CSV file that tells it how to balance 18650s as opposed to the lithium polymer packs that these are programmed with. But this is still good. My wiring's everything's fine. It'll power on as soon as we fix the config on it there. Okay, I'm gonna get these terminals off of here. I can pull the sled out. We'll mix some epoxy and get the sled in there. I also haven't done the magnets, but you've seen me do that in all the other vids. I might skip it for this one. Now you don't need or probably want to use a ton of epoxy. The only bad thing about the P enclosure is it's so tight. If you were to need to remove the 510, you'd have to break the sled out of there. In we go. I'll clamp that down. Another thing I've been doing as a finishing touch is I bought this stuff called liquid tape, and it's not a required step, but the exposed solder points on the sled here. I'm going to drop some of that on there. And that hardens to like rubber. Alright guys, magnets are in. It's a really nice fit. Give this thing a whirl. Vape's nice. So we're done. DNA 166, which is a DNA 250 board, powered by two 18650s. Again, in this nice small 1590 Alpinetech 1590 P enclosure. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.